This is Professor Amit Bhattacharya. I have entitled the keynote speech tentatively as The Dynamics of Perception, Gender and Sexuality in Post-Colonial Literatures. Before I begin, I must tell you something about the enormous difficulties that we are having to contend with. Let us first offer a prayer to the omnipotent World Wide Web for a consistent coverage and connectivity, because without that, any speech delivered on a virtual platform will just fall flat. Now, acceding to the demands of a former student, Bhaskar Chandra Sarkar, I have bitten off more than I can chew. The terrain is very vast and varied because the thematic focus of the seminar is gender and sexuality together, and the canvas should be post-colonial literature. So I must begin by talking about the academic responsibility. We in the academia have the responsibility more than others. Why? Because we are aware of the discursive currents, and we are really split beings, torn between the traditional binaristic conditioning and the informed academic liberalism. So we have to acknowledge the diversity of the field. Only talking straight will not do, because there are certain issues regarding gender and sexuality that are not static, that are dynamic, that are contingent, and that are based on our cultural assumptions and our ideological stance. We all know that gender and sexuality are basically descriptive categories. Often we hear that these are not facts, but acts. We also started our discussion long ago in the 60s and 70s of the last century by talking about sex being biological and gender being cultural. So it becomes imperative on my part to set the intellectual reader straight at this point. Now, by gender, I mean the way an individual understands and expresses himself or herself. And by sexuality, I mean the entire framework of who we are, induced by such diverse but interconnected considerations as body image, gender identity, gender roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, genitals, intimacies, relationships, love, and affection. So obviously, the implication is that there are both physical and mental dimensions to contend with. Because once sexuality encompasses attitude, values, knowledge, and behavior. As such, sexuality or the expression thereof is mediated by such factors, such determinants as family, culture, society, faith, and belief. We all know that we have to make sense of the world in terms of our maleness, femaleness, indefiniteness, in-betweenness, inertness, or beyondness. Because over and above the binaristic system of compulsory heterosexuality, now we have been forced. We have not really done it on our own. We have been forced by the long struggle of our fellow human beings who have dared to be different. They have forced us to now concede the existence of LGBTQIA+, lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgenders, and transsexuals, queer, intersex, asexual, and other sexualities. Now, when we talk about literature as a domain for the representation of gender and sexuality, we have to understand a basic fact, the fact of representation. So, if we talk about gender and sexuality in terms of performance, and if we talk about literature in terms of representation, then the space in between is covered by the mediative factor of perception. One has to perceive in order to represent. And one can only perceive on the basis of one's perspective. So perception is contingent upon perspective. And perspective in its own turn is determined by ideological considerations, by self-interest or group interest. It is dictated too by the dominant power structures. And that is why I have tentatively entitled my presentation as the dynamics of perception, the inner workings of perception, how we perceive in order to represent in and through literature. Now, I think the relationship between gender and sexuality on the other one hand and literature on the other is one of reflection and representation. Because we are talking about representation, there is an inherent politics thereof. And this politics of representation is basically dictated to by the dominant power structures. John Kenneth Galbraith has classified power as of three kinds, as being of three kinds. Condign power, that secures conformity by threatening unpleasant consequence. Compensatory power, that secures conformity by offering something in return. And conditioned power, that secures conformity by presenting before the individual or the group, the human subject, the desirability of conforming to prescriptive values and dictates of the society. dominated by culture. So, when we talk about post-colonial literature, we have to understand that any discussion of the representation of gender and sexuality in post-colonial literatures can only be partial. It cannot ever claim to be comprehensive. It has to be personal, because subjectivity willy-nilly will creep in, and it cannot be objective. And at the same time, one has to make it clear that any such discussion will be more indicative than explanatory, because of the paucity of time. And when such a speaker as Dayadisha Naike is waiting in the wings, I don't dare to overstay my welcome, for the simple fear of being cut off by the organizers or shouted down by the audience. Now, when we talk about post-colonial literature, when we talk about post-coloniality and post-colonialism, we have to understand that post-colonialism tries to interrogate the points of intersection between the colonizer's ideology and the colonized subjectivity. And in the process, creates agency and voice for the underprivileged and the voiceless. But unfortunately, our discussion of post-colonial literature is often confined to what is Anglophone literature at best, without paying much heed to the fact that historically there have been other colonial and imperial powers other than England or the United Kingdom. Even if we discard such other powers as Belgium, Denmark, Portugal, and so on and so forth, we have at least to take cognizance of France and Spain as colonial or imperial powers. So, any discussion of the representation of gender and sexuality in post-colonial literatures, and that's why I am not calling it literature, will have to take cognizance of the heterogeneity of the material and the representative perspective and practices. So, I will try to point out the presence of literary texts and authors who may not be Anglophone, but who are very, very important as regards any discussion of the subject in question. Well, friends, post-coloniality is a problematic subject because the definition of post-coloniality, the definition of post-colonialism should be as complex as the definition of colonialism and colonization. We all know the world has had a very, very checkered colonial past. As a result, we have to understand that any attempt to homogenize the matter will be unsuccessful. Now, when we talk about post-colonial literature as a vehicle for representing gender and sexuality, we have to understand that there are two basic currents, often working as cross currents: gender and sexuality, always are rooted in local practices that have ethnic and cultural dimensions. At the same time, thanks to colonization, thanks to the independence of the erstwhile colonies, thanks to globalization and large-scale dislocation of individuals and communities, gender identities and sexual orientations, gender and sexuality practices have all undergone different changes and transformations. We can bring to mind Edward Said's reference to Flaubert's encounter with Kuchuk Khanum, the courtesan, who, being terrified by the presence of a male from the colonizer's race, who is more moneyed and more powerful than she, kept mum and submissive, creating thereby the category of the Eastern female as passive and submissive and silent. So this was one representation of gender in colonial times. We all know that when we talk about gender, we have to talk about certain issues like gender roles, gender expectations, gender performativity, gender identity. When we talk about sexuality, we have to take into account the questions of sexual orientation and sexual choice. So all these things get represented in literature that, for the want of something more inclusive and more appropriate, is termed as post-colonial literature. We all know the problematics of nomenclature, because we know that post-colonial literature has often been very diverse, and especially today in 2020, because of globalization, because of diasporicity and transnationalism, the entire ball game has become different. And that is why I am going to deal with literary instances. The texts that I have chosen to talk about in some detail will set the stage for further discussion. And I will come back to certain issues that I have only tentatively raised till now. Now, gender and sexuality have been represented in post-colonial literature based on such factors as the location, imperial pasts, mediums, authorship, readership, and themes, techniques, and genres. So these are the things that I will base my discussion on. Let us take up for discussion the first text that I have chosen. It is indicative of the problems that we are having to face. For example, if I take up for discussion an autobiography of the Palestinian hijacker, Laila Khalid, My People Shall Live, the autobiography of a revolutionary. This book was published in 1973. We will see the very problematic terrain that confronts us. Laila Khalid is apparently a bad girl, a hijacker, co-opted by patriarchy, male militarism. She was born in Haifa. At the age of 4 in 1948, she, along with her parents, got evicted from Haifa because this place fell to the Zionist rule. So when she came to the age of 20, she was bold enough or foolhardy enough to proclaim that armed struggle is the only way to salvation. She twice hijacked planes and had to undergo imprisonment for some time. But the same person, who is a woman, who cannot totally ignore her own humanity, writes about certain factors, certain snippets of her own life. She talks about how she cried when she heard the news of J.F. Kennedy's assassination. How she had vacillated from the path of armed struggle and hijacking when she saw the pretty faces of children whose life she was going to endanger. The sexual dimension of her career, because she had to go shoulder to shoulder with her male counterparts, is also described in very graphic details in this book. Now, the second text that I will take up for discussion will be a poem. This poem is written by Kamala Das. The title of the poem is An Introduction. Here, in this poem, Kamala Das, a post-colonial poet from India, tells the readers about certain gender roles and gender expectations. She starts the poem by talking about her ignorance. This is very significant. I don't know politics. Her ignorance of politics. So even if her life is governed by politics, she is not expected to or accepted by her male counterparts, her patriarchal society, to know politics. She is fated to repeat the names of those in power, beginning with Nehru. So routine, repetitive act is what the woman is, as a gendered being, fated to perform. But she defies. She defies. She does not agree to remain only a cook, an embroiderer, a quarreler with servants. She wants to write. Society, patriarchal society, which stipulates that she should be only a domestic being, a domesticated being, does not want this. That is why society tries to alienate her. And so far as sexuality is concerned, for failing in mathematics at the tender age of 13, she is married off. She had asked for love, but what she gets in return is a stranger thrust on her life. He did not beat me, but my sad woman's body felt so beaten. And as a result, she tries to seek love outside of marriage. I met a man, loved him. Don't call him by any name. She is every man who wants a woman, just as I am every woman who wants love. But here also, her journey, her quest for acceptance is rebuffed. The he figure, the lover, is accommodated as a sword in its sheath, as tight-packed as it is. But she is not accepted in the same terms. And that's why she drinks lonely drinks in unknown cities. She dies with a rattle in her throat. Even though she also calls herself I, she is not accepted by society like her own male counterpart is. The third text that I am going to talk about is, I was talking about the necessity of dealing with not only Anglophone literature, but also other literary texts. So the next text I will take up for discussion will be one written by a French Algerian writer, Faiza Guène, who in 2004 wrote a novel, Kif Kif Demain, which was translated into English as Kif Kif or Same Thing Tomorrow. In 2006, Kif Kif Tomorrow. This is the story of Doria, a birth child, of Moroccan descent, living in France, in Paris. This is basically a coming of age narrative. Doria is abandoned by her father, who wants to have a male heir. By, again, the gender consideration of continuing the family line comes to the fore. And as such, this father abandons the child Doria and goes to Morocco to marry a younger woman. And the sexual encounters and the sexual reflections that Doria undergoes as she comes of age are dealt with in this particular book. And I am playing the role of a tempter here. I will try to tempt you to read these books. The next text that I am going to talk about is going to be, again, a very known book, Shyam Salvadurai's book, Funny Boy. We all know about it. But in any discussion of gender and sexuality in postcolonial literature, I think this can be a key text. Because this is about a funny boy, a funny one, Archie, who is a homosexual. He discovers not only at a very tender age, while playing with his girl cousins, she wants to play the bride, and Tanuja, one of her cousins, actually refuses to indulge. Then one of his uncles tells his father that you have a funny one here. And when RG, he is still a boy, he doesn't understand why he is being differentiated, why he is being discriminated against, why he is being sidelined from the games of our girl cousins. So when he says, why am I being left out? His mother responds with this, a very cryptic quote, because the sky is so high, because the pigs cannot fly, that's why. The sky is very high. The standards are very high. The standards of conformity are very high. One has to put up with this or shut up. Because a pig is not a bird. He cannot fly. He cannot reach the sky. And that's why he is left out. So he is not a compulsory heterosexual, and that's why he is different. So any discussion of the representation of gender and sexuality in postcolonial literature has to contend with the issues of dilemma and defiance, the issues of desire and difference. We know how still the boy RG feels fascinated by and drawn towards Jagan. And when he is sent by his father to Victoria Academy, I am reminded of David Copperfield being sent to the Salem House by Mr. Murdstone. Why is he sent to this academy, Victoria Academy? Because this will make you more of a man. There, he is irresistibly drawn towards a known homosexual guy, Shehan Soisa. And ultimately, despite the cultural construct of shame, despite diffidence, he ultimately discovers his homosexual leanings and has a sexual encounter, at least some sexual encounters. Feels shame, but goes with it all the same. Ultimately, because of the Tamil Sinhala conflict, the civil war, he is fated to leave the country. So before leaving the country, he for the final time makes love to Shana. But if you read this particular book, this is not only not the only consideration of gender and sexuality. We have to deal with Auntie Radha's fascination for Anil Ranasinghe across the ethnic divide. Again, we have to take cognizance of Amma's, that is Archie's mother, Earth's reawakened passion for, Uncle Daryl Uncle, the burger, who returns from Australia to investigate government corruption. So the entire question of sexual choice, sexual orientation, sexual jealousy, all these things are very, very subtly portrayed by Shamsul. The next text that I am going to talk about will be a novel by a Canadian Jamaican author, Nello Hopkinson. And this book is The Salt Rose. Now, this is a very, very important and interesting book. And I have chosen this book because this has got much to say about the representation of gender and sexuality in postcolonial writings. Before I deal with this book, we have to understand that, because gender and sexuality have always been greatly influenced by local practices, local customs, local belief systems, and local cultural taboos. So obviously, when we talk about post-colonial representation of gender and sexuality, we have to understand that either there are revisionist reworkings of colonial texts, like the White Sargasso, the reworking of Jane Eyre, or something like this thing, Robinson Crusoe being revised and reviewed by Derek Walcott in pantomime, or J.M. Coetzee in your folk. So there also, sexuality and gender have been represented in very subtle and varied ways. So coming back to my discussion of the novel, The Salt Rose, it is basically a speculative fiction wherein magic realism plays a very, very important part. History is reconstructed, reviewed, and reimagined with a lot of imagination, with fancy and fantasy. As a result, we are told about the life stories of three women, Mar, Jean Duval. Mar is basically a 18th century lesbian healer from Saint Dominic. Then Jean Duval is a 19th century lesbian healer from Saint Dominic. Then Mar is a 19th century lesbian healer from Saint Dominic. Then Jean Duval is a 19th century lesbian healer from Saint Dominic. Then Mar is a 19th century lesbian healer from Saint Dominic. Then a Haitian woman, very famous and notorious for being the mistress of the poet Charles Baudelaire, who is taken from the Paris of 1880s, And then there is also the 4th century prostitute turned saint, Thais or Merited, and who is ultimately called Saint Mary. Now they are all infused with the consciousness of a goddess, a hidden goddess. Let's see that, or easily. And this goddess infuses their bodies, inhabits their bodies. So unknowingly, they go about their life's business, and this goddess sits there pulling the strings and controlling their sexual, personal, and also revolutionary activities. Because this goddess feels for and aids the struggle for freedom engaged in by the Jews or the African slaves, the people, slave people. So here, the role of the goddess and the sexuality of these three women get a very prominent discussion by Nello Hopkins. The next text that I am going to talk about will be a play. In fact, 2 plays. First, I am going to talk about, again, a very known play, it is included in many, postgraduate courses, this is by Mahesh Dattani and this is Dance Like a Man. Because this play tells us much about gender roles and gender expectations. And also about the workings of sexuality. How lives are manipulated. How careers are compromised. All these things are discussed by Mahesh Dattani, a very bold, courageous playwright. Dancing like a man is some kind of an anathema. Because patriarchal society of a patriarch like Amritlal Pare, a one-time reformer, is not ready to accept dancing as a fit profession for a man. So Jairaj has to bear the brunt. And in order to fulfill her own desires for a successful career as a dancer, Ratna, Jairaj's wife, again another dancer, is ready to make deals with the patriarch Amritlal Pare. So she is allowed to continue with her dancing career. In return, she has to persuade Jairaj to become a man, to eschew dancing. So she, that is Ratna, often misguides and bullies Jairaj, who is a considerate male, a rare animal, in the patriarchal world for the patriarchy to contend with. So the next thing that I am going to talk about will be how Ratna uses her sexuality not only to bully and browbeat her husband, but also to plan a rosy future, a successful dancing career for her own daughter, from whom she also, that is Ratna also, expects to gain fame and money and power. So Lata, a younger Ratna, becomes a kind of a pawn. The next book that I am going to talk about will be Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's famous book, Americana. Yes. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Americana is about effeminate. I was telling you about dislocation and diasporicity, migration, as something that has been a ramification, an offshoot of globalization, and indirectly, it has been a result of colonization in the long run. So here, the representation of gender roles and gender expectations as regards the life of people like Ifemelu, Obenje's mother or Auntie Uju needs to be talked about. So when Ifemelu goes to America, meets Kurt or Blaine, two of her boyfriends over there, she sees how women are perceived. It has got an ethnic dimension because she is a black woman. She is treated in a particular way. And how black men are also thought about. A teenager like DK, Auntie Uju's son, by the general, the one-time paramour, a kind of a secret lover of Auntie Uju. You see, these things are discussed in in very unambiguous terms. So we see that in America, the gender expectations from Nigerian men and Nigerian women are discussed in great details. Even in America, the differences between the American black and the non-American and how they deal with questions of gender and sexuality should be considered in greater details. I know that any discussion of gender and sexuality in postcolonial literature cannot be just genre specific, because there are other issues. Because there have been different colonial powers, because there have been different conditions in different regions, because there have been different types of colonies. A settler colony like Australia or Canada, and a colony such as India, which could boast of a very ancient civilization. So, and quite a numerous, population. So these colonies cannot be dealt with or discussed in the same way. And as a result, we have to be able and willing to agree to such differences, being there and being accepted. Here, so far as the dynamics of perception is concerned, I can still recall the title of the Salt Roads, because this is what connects the colonies and their peoples with their pre-colonial roots through the salt roads of sweat, blood, and tears. 3 bodily fluids indicative of 3 functions and 3 moods. We all know about that. We all know about the theory of humor, as Ben Jonson had taught us once, based on the medical system of classical times. Okay, so I must round off my discussion here by posing a few questions. While discussing the representation of gender and sexuality in postcolonial literatures, can we afford to ignore or keep outside of our purview the enormous literary output from the United States of America? Because America was also at one time under colonial rule. Scholars nowadays have raised their voices to include American literature under the descriptive domain of postcolonial literature. The second question that I want to pose, these are not new questions. People have raised them, but I need to remind the audience of these questions because they are going to be very, very instrumental in setting our intellectual radar straight. I'm repeating this. The second question is, do we think that post-colonial literature only refers to literature produced in and by the erstwhile colonies? Don't we think that the mother countries, the imperial powers, they have also been influenced by the experience of colonization? So if their literature in colonial times would be influenced, I'm reminded of, say, a Mansfield Park or a Jane Eyre. Or okay, go back, even your Robinson Crusoe. So they were greatly influenced by the project and process of colonization. And the wealth, the cultural framework, the political system in the erstwhile colonial powers, imperial powers, they have been influenced by their colonial past. So don't we think that literatures from the mother countries, the erstwhile colonizers, should also be called post-colonial? The third question that I must point out is the necessity of acknowledging and making allowances for the heterogeneous nature of the colonial experience, whereby the roles and realities of other colonial and imperial powers should also be talked about. And the last thing that I must point out here is that, talking about the attitude towards gender and sexuality, as revealed in and through post-colonial literatures today, we have to understand that the thematic focus and the technical aspects are very, very significant, because now we are not only talking about or talking to a restricted audience. We are talking about a global audience. But at the same time, we cannot ignore either the social realities on the local level and also the demands of the domestic reader. Because as the honored teacher in charge was pointing out, that because of this COVID situation, we are trying to reinvent our response, recalibrate our response to the pandemic situation. And for that, we have to take cognizance of difference and divergence. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you.